The silence of the cave is older than language. Buried beneath layers of time, deep in the dusty hills of Jebel Irhoud, lies the skull of a man who never knew he would one day rewrite human history. Discovered in Morocco and dated to nearly 300,000 years ago, it shattered every assumption we had about our species. Not East Africa, not Ethiopia, but here, on the edge of the Atlantic, in the heart of the Maghreb, a new genesis. What does it mean when the world's oldest Homo sapiens remains are found in Morocco? It means that this land has not just witnessed human history. It is human history. Yet this is only the beginning. Thousands of years later, another mystery emerges. In the shadowed burial caves of Tafrelt, ancient bones belonging to the Iberomaurusian culture whisper of a people long vanished. Their tools are primitive, their culture poorly understood. But inside their bones, scientists uncovered something unexpected: DNA. And not just any DNA, but something utterly unique. A signal found in modern Amazigh genomes, echoing across millennia. That signal, traced through genomic mapping, shows that 30% of today's Amazigh DNA comes directly from these Iberomaurusians. That number isn't just large, it's staggering. And here's the catch. This genetic marker fades the moment you move east of Libya. It simply vanishes. As if these people, this lineage, had been born, lived, and remained locked in North Africa. Now pause. Imagine that. A genetic lineage so ancient, so hyperlocalized, that it became the backbone of a modern population, but only in one corner of the world. Morocco. This is not a nation of borrowed identities. It is a civilization built on continuity. The Iberomaurusians are sometimes linked to European Cro-Magnons. They share skeletal traits, burial traditions, even tool styles. But unlike the Cro-Magnons, whose genetic signature faded in waves of later migrations, the Iberomaurusians persisted. Their legacy wasn't erased. It was engraved into the genome of an entire people. Today, in the rugged faces of Berber tribes from the Middle Atlas, that ancient blood still pulses. In genetic studies, it emerges as the foundation of the Maghrebi genome. And what's more haunting, it cannot be found elsewhere. Not in Europe, not in the Middle East, not in sub-Saharan Africa. Only here. Why? Because Morocco, walled by the Mediterranean and guarded by the desert, became a crucible. A place where time didn't just pass, it condensed. Cultures came and went. Empires rose and collapsed. But the bloodlines held. There is something profoundly humbling in that. While borders changed, languages shifted, and flags were replaced, the people stayed. The genome stayed. That Iberomaurusian core, weathered but unbroken, became a silent witness to 20,000 years of survival. So when we ask why Moroccan DNA is so unique, this is where we must begin. Not with conquest, not with Arabization, but with silence, with bones beneath the earth, with a people who never wrote their name in stone, but carved it into the double helix of their descendants. They are not forgotten. They are Morocco. Long before it became a graveyard of dust and silence, the Sahara was alive. A world of rivers, lakes, and green open savannas, teeming with game and shaded by acacia groves. Where now there is sand, there was once soil, and in that soil, the seeds of transformation were sown. Rains came in rhythms older than civilization, and when they came, they opened a gateway, not of conquest, but of connection. Across this wet Sahara, thousands of years ago, something astonishing happened. Farmers walked in from the east. But they weren't just any farmers. These were the children of the Neolithic, migrants from Anatolia, bearers of agriculture, language, and a new way of life. They crossed into North Africa not by force, but by flood and fertility. The earth made the invitation. The humans accepted. Their DNA, distinct from the indigenous Maghrebi population, carried the genetic signal of the early European and Near Eastern agriculturalists. And when it entered Morocco, it didn't erase what came before. It blended. Today, nearly 40% of northern Moroccan DNA shows the imprint of these Anatolian Neolithic farmers. This isn't theory. It's embedded in the structure of their chromosomes. In the PCA charts of population genetics, these ancient farmers reappear, like ghosts hiding in the alleles of modern men and women. They didn't come in a single wave. They filtered in slowly, steadily, through Iberia, crossing the narrow strait where Europe kisses Africa. They passed through what is now southern Spain, bringing grains, sheep, and new mitochondrial haplogroups. And somewhere in this passage, the Mediterranean itself became a bridge, not a border. But what's most haunting is this. The Neolithic component in Morocco is older than the Arab expansion, older than the Roman legions, older even than Carthage. And yet, it's still here, quietly inhabiting the cells of millions, hiding in plain sight. This migration wasn't just genetic. It was ecological. It happened because the Sahara allowed it. A green Sahara, a living one, enabled a human exchange that rewired the ancestry of an entire region. Then the rains ended. The garden died. And the desert we know was born. But the DNA survived. When the Sahara dried, it closed again. Isolated, Morocco began a new chapter, but with the Neolithic signature sealed into its foundations. A buried inheritance from a time when the world was open and fertile. In the faces of northern Moroccans today, there are remnants of that old agricultural world. In their blood, there are whispers of Anatolia. And in their genomes, you can still hear the echo of a time when the earth was generous, and strangers could become family. This isn't mythology. It's not folklore. It's biology. And so, when we ask why Moroccan DNA is so unique, we find part of the answer in the lost climate of a forgotten Sahara, a place where civilizations were built not with war, but with wheat, not by sword, but by soil. It began not with conquest, but with curiosity. Ships appeared on Morocco's coasts long before legions did. They came from the east, sleek, cedar-built, carved with the eyes of Phoenician gods. Merchants, not warriors. Traders, not tyrants. But every exchange left a trace. As Phoenician settlements took root, in places like Mogador and Tingis, the earliest threads of Mediterranean DNA began to sow themselves into the Maghrebi genome, not through invasion, but through intermarriage, diplomacy, and generations of quiet integration. Then came Carthage, a Punic empire built from the bones of Tyre, casting its influence across North Africa. Morocco became its western flank, a cultural hybrid zone between desert and sea. And while few ruins remain, the DNA remembers. Recent studies reveal subtle Levantine signatures in select Moroccan lineages, ghost fragments from a time when Carthaginian tongues echoed in the markets of Lixus. But it was Rome that left the deepest imperial mark. As the empire expanded into Mauritania Tingitana, it brought more than roads and rule. Roman soldiers, auxiliaries from every corner of the Mediterranean, settled, stayed, and left children. Berber women became mothers to sons whose Y chromosomes carried Italic, Balkan, and Anatolian markers. Over centuries, these genes fused with the Berber backbone, embedding cosmopolitan fragments into local bloodlines. We don't need inscriptions to prove it. The genome speaks. Modern Moroccan DNA reveals pockets of European-related ancestry, especially in the north, a subtle but persistent genetic echo of imperial Rome. But not all regions were touched equally. The mountains resisted. In the interior, Berber clans remained genetically distinct, shielded by geography, language, and fierce autonomy. While coastal cities became Mediterranean mosaics, the highlands preserved the old code, undiluted, enduring. The beauty of this genetic legacy lies in its asymmetry. Empires came with power, but it was the people who chose what to absorb and what to resist. Morocco's genome is not uniform. It's a palimpsest, one where some chapters were etched deeply, and others barely skimmed the surface. There is a particular irony here. Rome once declared this region a frontier, a fringe of empire, and yet in modern Moroccan DNA, its presence remains like an afterimage, faint but undeniable. When we trace the bloodlines of today's Moroccans, we're not just mapping migrations. We're excavating memory, not through ruins or scrolls, but through mitochondrial strands and silent haplogroups that cross centuries like whispers. These ancient empires may have crumbled, their statues broken, their cities reclaimed by earth, but inside the cells of Morocco's people, their stories continue, unspoken, unshaken, and alive. The sun had barely risen over the Maghreb when the first riders crossed the sands. They came from the east, guided by faith, driven by fire. The Arab armies did not just bring the sword. They carried something more enduring, a system of belief, a language of unity, and an identity that would fracture, fuse, and eventually reshape a continent. But here in Morocco, something unexpected happened. The land did not submit, it adapted. It did not forget, it remembered. And that memory, encoded in DNA, tells a story far more complex than conquest. For centuries, it was believed that Arabization in North Africa was cultural, that the Berbers simply adopted the tongue of Mecca, the customs of Medina. But under the microscope, the chromosomes reveal a deeper truth. Enter haplogroup J, M267, a lineage born in the heart of Arabia. It surges in modern Moroccan populations, particularly in those who identify as Arab. Not everywhere, but in defined pockets. It's not a myth. It's measurable. This Y chromosome didn't drift quietly. It arrived in pulses, the earliest during the Islamic expansions of the 7th century, followed by waves of Bedouin migration centuries later. Tribes like the Banu Hillel, Banu Sulaim, and Makil, they didn't just pass through. They stayed. They settled. And they married into the landscape. But what makes Morocco unique is what it chose to retain. In Berber-speaking enclaves, especially in mountainous regions, the genetic footprint of Arabia is faint. Instead, we find the dominance of EM81, a signature of deep-rooted Maghrebi ancestry. Yet, even here, subtle traces of Arabian genes flow beneath the surface. Like ink bleeding into old parchment, they color the past without erasing it. The paradox is this: while Arabic became the dominant language, and Islam the spiritual heart, the underlying genetics resisted full transformation. The genome is hybrid, not overwritten. This duality lives in Morocco today, an Arab nation with a Berber soul, a people whose identity reflects not substitution, but synthesis. In cities like Fez and Marrakesh, the Arab influence is undeniable, culturally, architecturally, and genetically. But in the valleys of the Rif, the dialects shift, and so does the DNA. There, traditions trace back not to Damascus, but to something older, something autochthonous. The narrative is not one of loss. It is one of layering. The Arabization of Morocco is a story where the conqueror became kin, and the conquered remained unconquered, at least in their blood. Even as mosques rose and Arabic poetry replaced oral Amazigh verse, the chromosomes whispered another lineage. Genetic studies now confirm it. The Arab presence in Moroccan DNA is real, but it did not erase the Berber foundation. It augmented it. In every Moroccan Arab, there is likely a Berber grandfather. In every Berber, a whisper of Arabia may reside. So, what does it mean to be Arab in Morocco? Or Berber? Perhaps the real question is, why choose? There are stories we pass down, and stories we bury. In Morocco, one of the deepest lies beneath centuries of silence. A story told not in books or ruins, but in the double helix of the living. You won't find it in school textbooks or carved in stone, but you will find it in blood, and what it reveals is both painful and profound. As early as the 8th century, human cargo began to move across the Sahara. Not caravans of trade, but caravans of captivity. Men, women, and children, taken from the Sahel, from forests of West Africa, marched north in chains towards cities that would never be home. Slavery in North Africa did not leave ruins, but it left legacies, and they are visible today in the Moroccan genome. In certain regions, especially along the Atlantic Plain and southern corridors, genetic studies show sub-Saharan DNA contributions reaching up to 55% in segments of the population. This is not a minor trace. It is a defining component. And yet, until the tools of modern genetics emerged, it was largely invisible. The markers are clearest in mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line. Specifically, haplogroups like L2A, L3B, and L0A, which are widely found in West and Central Africa. Their presence in Moroccan Arabs is elevated, while in Berber populations, especially in the north, the numbers drop sharply, sometimes below 5%. But this isn't just about recent history. A closer look reveals that some of these haplogroups predate the trans-Saharan slave trade by thousands of years. L3* lineages, for instance, have been traced back nearly 20,000 years, suggesting ancient migration waves, long before recorded slavery, long before Islam. This complicates the narrative. It means that while the slave trade intensified sub-Saharan admixture, it wasn't the only source. Deep time movements, perhaps linked to a Wada Sahara, perhaps to forgotten contacts, had already braided these bloodlines together. Yet the forced movement of millions cannot be dismissed. Between the 10th and 19th centuries, North Africa became both a destination and a redistribution point in one of history's most understudied human tragedies. Enslaved Africans were absorbed into households, markets, cities. Over time, their identities faded into local cultures, but their DNA remained. In the town of El Jadida, near the Atlantic coast, modern populations show some of the highest frequencies of sub-Saharan mitochondrial lineages in the country. Not by accident. This region was a hub of commerce and bondage. The paradox is striking. In the genetic maps, the trauma becomes data. The suffering becomes sequence. A molecular archaeology of sorrow, hidden inside the people themselves. But even in this, there's resilience. Those who were taken, erased from history, now reemerge through science. Not as statistics, but as ancestors, as essential chapters in the Moroccan story. This is not about blame. It is about recognition, understanding, completion. Because until these threads are acknowledged, the fabric of Moroccan identity remains unfinished. In the end, what we call Moroccan is not one thing. It is not Arab, or Berber, or African. It is all of them. And within that mixture, there are chains. Not always visible, not always remembered, but still very much present, wound tightly into the genome. They arrived by sea, not as conquerors, but as refugees. Their names were erased, their homes taken, their language forbidden. What remained, what survived, was carried in silence across the water. Into Morocco. The fall of Al-Andalus wasn't just the end of Muslim Spain. It was the start of something else, a great, unspoken migration. As the Christian kingdoms reclaimed Iberia, centuries of cultural coexistence unraveled. In the shadows of cathedrals, Muslims were ordered to convert or leave. Many did both. Some became Christian in name, but remained Islamic in spirit. They were called Moriscos, and soon they too were driven out. Between the late 15th and early 17th centuries, waves of Moriscos were expelled by sword, decree, and fear. Historians record the numbers, 200,000 to 300,000. But DNA records something different. Not the loss, the arrival. Across the northern rim of Morocco, in cities like Tétouan, Chefchaouen, Rabat, and Sale, genetic studies now reveal significant levels of Iberian ancestry. These aren't echoes of colonization. They're the remnants of exile. They belong to the Moriscos. The timing matches. The signatures match. And more than that, the cultural layering aligns. Dialects in northern Morocco still preserve Andalusi patterns. Architecture in Old Medina's mirrors that of Granada. And in the genome, there are clear Iberian traces that cannot be explained by ancient Rome or Phoenician trade. But the Moriscos weren't alone. Alongside them came the Sephardic Jews, pushed from Spain under royal edicts, stripped of their rights, their property, their place. Many fled to North Africa, welcomed by Moroccan dynasties that understood exile. And in their bloodlines, a genetic mosaic formed, connected to both Ashkenazi and North African Jewish communities, but with unique European maternal signatures. In certain Jewish lineages from Morocco, studies show that more than a quarter descend from a single female ancestor. That's not folklore. That's mitochondrial precision. A woman whose legacy outlived her name. And yet, their stories did not end in trauma. They began again in the streets of Fez, the markets of Tangier, the alleys of Meknes. They built new homes. They married into new worlds. They left behind something no decree could erase: heritage. Modern Moroccan DNA carries these imprints not as scars, but as signatures of survival. Where governments saw threats, genetics sees kinship. Where kings exiled, genes connected. A paradox that only time could reveal. These migrations weren't conquests. They weren't expansions of empire. They were the involuntary inheritance of crisis. And still, they became Moroccan. So when a DNA test shows Iberian or Sephardic ancestry in someone from Tangier or Essaouira, it's not a surprise. It's a return, a reminder that exile does not erase origin. It transforms it. Morocco didn't just absorb these people. It became them. And in doing so, It forged a nation where bloodlines span seas, and memories live in genomes. High in the mountains where the wind speaks through cedar branches, a lineage waits. It doesn't need monuments. It doesn't crave recognition. It simply persists in silence, in solitude, in the bloodstream of a people who never vanished. Amid all the migrations, empires, and displacements that reshaped North Africa, one genetic signature endured like stone beneath the sand. It has no anthem, no crown, but it outlived dynasties. Its name is EM81. This Y chromosome lineage is more than just common in Morocco. It dominates. Among Berber-speaking populations, it reaches as high as 90%. In certain valleys of the Middle Atlas and Anti-Atlas, it's nearly absolute. No invading army, no shifting border, no foreign blood ever managed to dilute it fully. Geneticists call it a founder marker, one born from a small, stable group tens of thousands of years ago. But to understand its power, you have to understand what it represents. It is not simply Berber. It is Proto-Berber. Its roots trace back more than 14,000 years, to a time when agriculture hadn't yet taken hold in North Africa, when the world was still reeling from a last glacial maximum. And yet, even then, these people, the carriers of EM81, had already made this land their own. While other haplogroups came and went, Anatolian, Levantine, Sub-Saharan, European, EM81 stayed rooted. It became the quiet backbone of a population constantly in flux. Even as cities were built by Carthaginians and renamed by Romans, even as Arab tribes poured across the desert, this marker held steady in the highlands and hinterlands. Its most dominant subclade, EM183, now defines a massive portion of the Maghrebi male lineage. But it's not just a number. It's a survival story. Because while cultural identities were rewritten, from Tamazight to Arabic, from tribal confederations to Islamic emirates, the chromosome never changed sides. It remained buried in fathers and passed to sons. Unchanged. Uninterrupted. This is the thread that binds the oldest inhabitants of Morocco to their modern descendants. Not by myth, not by language, but by inheritance so deep it cannot be seen, only sequenced. And still, it didn't remain isolated. Moroccan men carrying EM81 traveled. Some were captured in European raids. Others served in foreign armies. Some migrated north in modern times. And with them, this marker, once confined to the Atlas Mountains, began showing up in unexpected places. Sicily, southern Spain, even as far as France and parts of Latin America. It became Morocco's invisible export, not carried by caravans, but by bloodlines. Today, when someone tests their DNA and finds EM81, they're not just uncovering ancestry. They're unlocking continuity, a signal that their male lineage survived ice ages, invasions, colonization, and collapse, and never stopped. In a world obsessed with origins, this marker gives something rare, proof of staying. So as we reach the final layers of the Moroccan genome, we find that the most powerful story isn't the one of mixing, but of remaining, of a people who never stopped being themselves, no matter what name history gave them. EM81 didn't conquer. It endured.